Chances are, if you're watching this and you live in the US, you haven't been alive for a time when abortion wasn't legal. So news of this pending court decision that may end up taking away that right, probably pretty surprising. Maybe a little bit shocking, you may be worried, maybe even scared, confused, trying to figure out what in the world is going on. I hear you. So let's walk through some of it together. We'll try to figure some of it out. Where's a good place to begin?
Is a fetus a human being? This seems to be the central question.
Oh yeah. Thank you, George. Is a fetus a human being? Some, not all, but some of this debate centers around different interpretations of this question, hearing it in fundamentally different ways, then responding accordingly. One way to look at it is a fetus human? This is what the pro-life side would look at when arguing that life begins at fertilization, when the sperm fertilizes the egg. The zygote is formed with unique genetic material that differs from the sperm and the egg individually. Is this human? Yes. This is a new and unique human cell. And so the pro-life fundamentalists would argue that this is the point where life would begin, and it should be protected from that point. When other people argue that the unborn are not humans, this is one of the main counter-arguments. Of course it is, and they are right from the way that they're looking at it. The cell that's formed at fertilization is indeed a human cell, and of course it's a human cell. What else would it be? A dog cell? A horse cell? It's a human cell. This really isn't in dispute. Here's where the disagreement begins, where the pro-choice side sees the question, is a fetus a human being, a bit differently and as being more complex. They would think of it as, is an unborn fetus an independent human capable of surviving on its own with the same rights and protections of personhood afforded to the mother? And this is the balancing act we have to strike. When do the unborn have rights as a person? When do the rights of the unborn come up to equal the rights of any other person, including the mother? Where is that line? So if we take the position that the unborn don't have these rights from the moment of fertilization, we'll come back to that point again later, then where do they attain them? Where does personhood actually begin then? To figure this out, let's take a look at all the other different places where it could possibly. Fertilization at 0 weeks. This point we already discussed. Another one is implantation, which happens within the first week, when the zygote implants on the uterus wall and the pregnancy actually begins. And this is a crucial step in the process because sometimes, well, hey George, could you help us out again?
Not every egg makes it that far. 80% of a woman's fertilized eggs are rinsed and flushed out of her body once a month during those delightful few days she has. They wind up on sanitary napkins, and yet they are fertilized eggs.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it. Now, I can't speak to the actual percentages there, but the overall point remains the same. This is an important point we'll return to later. We also have gastrulation, where the embryo loses its ability to actually form identical twins, so it can no longer split apart, so maybe this is the point where life begins. By the way, this is my breakdown, so there may be some mistakes here. I may say some things wrong. Keep in mind, not a biologist. We're looking at the big picture here, specifically the law and criminalization aspects we'll talk about later. That's more my field. Another possibility is when it moves from being an embryo into being a fetus, which it will be until the point of birth. At about 8 weeks, it could also potentially be a person at that point. Then we go up to viability. This is about 24, 26 weeks. This is the point where the fetus is viable outside the womb. This is the standard that was set up in Roe v. Wade. It was a little bit longer at first. Over the course of time, with improvements in medical technology, we're able to sustain the life a little bit earlier. This is also the point where brain waves will start to develop. The disappearance of brain waves is often marked as a point of death, could also be marked as a point of life as well. This is the current standard point of viability. This is what is likely to be overturned by this Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court. Another potential point is just a couple weeks later when the fetus is actually able to feel pain. Could that be the point where we mark it as being a person? If it can feel pain, it might change the game a little bit. And then the last point is birth, when a baby comes out of the womb and takes its first breath, the biblical standard. I'll come back to that again later. Any of these points could potentially be used to mark where personhood begins, and therefore the fetus would have rights, and an abortion after that point would not be appropriate. There's a strong case to be made that many of these points would make more sense than drawing a red line at the point of fertilization and still account for the rights of the woman carrying the unborn. Here's my take on when the right to abortion would apply. The first trimester, the first 13 weeks, yes, in all all circumstances. Pregnancy is not very far along. There's no way it could possibly survive outside the womb. Therefore, no restrictions should be put on a woman's right to choose at that time. Third trimester? No, mostly. There's not an absolute right to an abortion necessarily to the date of birth. There's a certain point up until which you can reasonably make a choice, but after that, the point of viability, which is the Roe standard, now you're getting to the point where you're killing a potential child that could survive outside the womb. So, strong case can be made that restrictions should be put on abortion, the baby should be removed from the womb and tried to be saved. Now, there are other circumstances, of course, if something goes wrong where it can't survive outside the womb, if the mother's life is at risk, those would be the exceptions. And then we come to the second trimester in the middle. That's the gray area. That's the part where, well, I'm not quite so sure. Put a big question mark there. I'll refer to this as the zone of legitimate debate, because where do you draw the line exactly within this zone? Where's the appropriate spot? I'm not arrogant enough to definitively draw that line, but somewhere in here, in my estimation, is the best place to strike that balance, especially for such a hotly contested issue when we're dealing with the possibility of life and ending a life, but also make sure she still has rights, to make sure she still has a say over what happens with her own body. And I'm in good company. This is where most people fall, somewhere in this middle zone, wanting it to be legal, but with some restrictions, particularly after the pregnancy gets far enough along. The views on this remained actually remarkably consistent over time. The latest poll in this chart, only 1 in 5 believe it should be illegal, outlawed at all times. A little less than a third always illegal, and 48% legal only in certain circumstances, so about half. So that's about 80% think abortion should be legal at least at some points. But that's not the direction that we're going in if the national right to an abortion is overturned. If that right is suddenly